Section 7 of From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Frances Browne, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Robert Browning. Browne, Frances, Irish, 1816 through blank. Here is the story of a little girl who was blind from the time she was 18 months old, who never saw with her eyes the blue sky, the green trees, the fresh spring flowers, and yet found within herself a great, wide, beautiful, wonderful world which she saw far more vividly and could describe to others far more clearly than many who could see. Frances Browne was born in the little mountain village of Donegal in Ireland in the year 1816. She was the seventh of 12 children, and her father, the village postmaster, was in the poorest circumstances. Because she was blind, Frances was not given the education that was freely offered to her brothers and sisters, and by them so little valued. But with persistent determination she fought her way to that knowledge. Every evening she used to listen when her brothers and sisters recited their lessons aloud in preparation for the next day's classes, and would learn what they said by heart, untiringly reciting it to herself when everyone else was asleep, to impress it upon her memory. During the day she would hire her brothers and sisters to read to her by promising to do their share of the household tasks in return. Thus, in exchange for numberless wipings and scrubbings in the kitchen, she received lessons in grammar, geography, and various other subjects. Whenever her offer of doing their work failed to win her brothers and sisters, she would engage their services by repeating to them stories which they themselves had read and long ago forgotten, or by inventing for them the most interesting and fanciful tales of her own. There were no bookstores in Stranrawer or within 3 counties round about, nor were there any spare pennies at home with which to buy books. So Frances borrowed treasured volumes from all who came to the house and from everyone in the village. And thus, as time passed, she acquired a better education than many a child who could see. From the age of 7, Frances began to write poems, but when she was 14 she heard the Iliad read and was so impressed with its grandeur that her own poems seemed paltry things, and in utter disgust she threw them into the fire. It was not until she was 24 years old that a volume of Irish songs was read to her and her own music thus reawakened. She now wrote several poems which were offered to various magazines, and to her great joy and astonishment accepted and printed. After this, her work began to be successful, and the first use to which she put her earnings was to educate a sister to read to her and be her secretary. In 1847 she set out for Edinburgh to begin her literary career, taking with her the sister secretary and her mother, and assuming, blind though she was, the responsibility of supporting all 3 of them. In Edinburgh she wrote steadily anything she was asked to write: tales, sketches, reviews, poems, novels, and stories for children. Her industry was amazing, and though she never earned a great deal of money, she made friends with some of the greatest men and women of the day, and was always able to fulfill her affectionate purpose of caring for her mother. Frances Browne's best-loved works were her stories for children, and of these the most popular was Granny's Wonderful Chair, which was written in 1856. For many years this interesting book was out of print, but in 1887 Frances Hodgson Burnett republished it with a preface under the title Stories from the Lost Fairy Book, retold by the child who read them. Since then, Granny's Wonderful Chair has returned to its rightful place in children's literature. How wonderful was the richness of that world which this blind girl found within her own darkness! Nowhere in all her works is there a word of complaint about her blindness. There is only the giving forth of a wealth of joy and beauty. How did a writer who never saw a coach or a palace, or a picture of a coach or a palace, tell so convincingly of coaches and palaces and multitudes. Whence came her vivid word pictures of the little cottage on the edge of a great forest with tall trees behind, the swallows building in the eaves, the daisies growing thick before the door? A love of nature was in her soul. In spite of her blindness, she found within herself a wonderful perception of the beauty of the world. With her poet's spirit she saw all the green and leafy places of the earth, all its flowery ways, while these were trodden heedlessly, mayhap, by those about her with the gift of sight. It was amazing, too, the wonderful reach of her knowledge. Her stories are of many lands and many periods, from the French Revolution and the scenery of Lower Normandy to the time of the Young Pretender in England, from the fine frosts and clear sky, the long winter nights and long summer days of Archangel, to the banks of the Orange River in Africa. And she was perfectly at home, whether she told of shepherds on the moorland, the green pastures dotted with snow-white sheep, or whether her fancy dived beneath the sea midst hills of marble and rocks of Spa. Indeed, the story of Frances Browne's life is scarcely less interesting than her own wonderful books of fancy, and there has never been a nobler example of the fact that circumstances can never conquer a strong and beautiful spirit. She who in poverty and blindness could secure her own education and press on through every obstacle to the most complete development of her powers, giving to the world a wealth of joy and beauty, and never a word of complaint, has indeed left in her own life as beautiful a story as could ever be written. Important works: Granny's Wonderful Chair. Browning, Elizabeth Barrett. English, 1806 through 1861. Browning, Robert. English, 1812 through 1889. In a most picturesque and lovely home in the Malvern Hills, near Wales, there lived once with 10 lively brothers and sisters a little girl named Elizabeth Barrett. The country round about that fine old place was wonderfully green and beautiful. Dimpled close with hill and valley, dappled very close with shade, summer snow of apple blossoms, running up from glade to glade. And the little girl drank in the loveliness of it all as she raced and chased and romped about with her brothers and sisters. She was very fond of books, too, and when her best beloved brother Edward began to study Greek with a tutor, she joined him and used to sit in her little chair, with her book in one hand and a doll tenderly cherished in the other, persistently twisting her tongue around the strange Greek words. Ever after, Elizabeth continued to love the old Greek stories and to study them. Sometimes she said that she dreamed more often of Agamemnon than of Moses, her beautiful black pony. One year the little girl had a great flower bed laid out in the garden. It was shaped like an enormous giant. This, she said, was Hector, son of Priam, mighty hero of Troy. He had eyes of blue gentians, and scented grass for locks. His helmet was made of golden daffodils, his breastplate of daisies, and in his hand, all ready for the fray, he bore a sword of lilies. Elizabeth's very closest chum in her childhood was her father, a fine type of English gentleman. Often she used to write little poems and show them to him in secret when no one else was about. But when she was 14 years old she wrote a long poem of 1,500 lines, all about one of the Greek stories she loved. It was called The Battle of Marathon, and her father thought it so remarkable that he had it published. The girl was a wonderfully graceful, dainty little creature, of a slight, delicate figure, with a shower of dark curls falling on either side of a most expressive face. Her eyes were large and tender, richly fringed by dark lashes, and her smile was like a sunbeam. One day, when she was 15, Elizabeth decided to go for a ride on her pony, Moses, but Moses was not brought up ready and harnessed exactly on the moment when she wanted him, so, in a fit of impatience, she flounced out after him into the field. There she attempted to saddle him herself, but as she did so, she fell and the saddle came crashing down on top of her. The result of her impatience was that she was severely hurt, and there followed for her years of invalidism, during which she never went out again in the same old free way to ramble over the hills and romp in the out of doors. As time passed, she went to live in various different places, for a while in Torquay in beautiful Devonshire, but wherever she went there hung over her almost continuously this cloud of illness. The long days when she was confined to her room she spent in study and in writing poetry for various magazines, but for many years her chief means of communication with the outside world was by means of letters only. Nevertheless, these letters of hers were always bright and vivacious, with small mention of her troubles. Little by little, the young woman, thus so constantly confined to a sick room, grew to be a well-known poet. It is noteworthy, too, that the poems she wrote under such conditions had no hint of weakness, but were rather remarkable for their strength. One day a great man, one of the greatest of English poets, wrote Elizabeth Barrett a letter in admiration for her work. This great man was Robert Browning, and Elizabeth Barrett admired his work as much as he did hers, so that they soon began writing regularly to one another. The outcome of their correspondence was that Mr. Browning came one day to see the delicate little lady and induced her to marry him, although she thought herself too weak and ill to marry anyone. Her new joy and happiness, however, lifted her out of her invalidism and almost transformed her. Mr. Browning carried her off with him to live beneath the warm and sunny skies of Italy, and here the two spent all the rest of Mrs. Browning's life. It was chiefly in the interesting old town of Florence, with its hoary gray stone buildings and its splendid treasures of art, that they lived. Mrs. Browning took the keenest interest in the Italian people, who were just then struggling for their independence, and as she looked down on the ardent young patriots from the windows of her home, the famous Casa Guida Palace, she wrote poems full of love and sympathy for them. Indeed, her poetry is always full of the deepest and tenderest feeling and the truest love for all that is just and good. It was in Florence, too, that a little son, Robert, was born to Mrs. Browning, and the mother, who by now had become the greatest of living woman poets, had as much joy in all the wonderful things her little boy did as any less famous mother. The life of Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning was remarkably happy together. They visited Venice and all the most beautiful spots in Italy, and were absolutely one in the love, admiration, and devotion which they bore to one another. Frequently they were visited by friends, many of whom were Americans, and whoever was fortunate enough to be the guest of the Brownings in their happy home always came away deeply impressed with the beautiful family life he had seen there. When Mrs. Browning died, the citizens of Florence, grateful for her love and sympathetic understanding, placed on the wall of Casa Guida a marble tablet sacred to her memory. Mr. Browning and his little son then went sorrowfully back to England. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Casa Guida Windows, Aurora Leigh. Robert Browning, the Pied Piper of Hamelin, an incident of the French camp. End of section 7.